A pink foreclosure slip fluttered under the wiper blade of a rusted 1990 Ford F-150. 60-year-old Ray sat in the driver's seat chewing on a cold sandwich. He stared out at the family woodshop, its faded sign barely hanging on. 3 generations of sweat were about to be swallowed by the bank. But Ray didn't go to the bank that morning. He went to the county land auction. Laughter echoed across the courthouse steps when the auctioneer's hammer dropped. For exactly $800, every last cent Ray had to his name, the old carpenter had just bought Parcel 4, a stinking mosquito-infested stretch of Blackwood swamp. Carter, a local real estate developer with a slick suit and too much cologne, leaned over with a smirk. "You planning to farm mosquitoes out there, old man? That place is a natural toilet." Ray didn't answer. He just folded the deed, tucking it inside an old leather journal, and walked away. Fast forward 3 days. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and rotting moss. Ray stood waist-deep in the toxic black mud, a heavy-duty D-ring shackle cold in his calloused hands. He took a deep breath, dove under the murky water, and locked the steel cable onto something massive buried deep in the muck. He broke the surface, wiping thick sludge from his eyes. On the bank, the old Ford's winch screamed, the 12,000-pound cable pulling so tight it hummed like a guitar string ready to snap. The truck's rear tires slid in the dirt. Whatever was down there wasn't giving up easily. Ray just smiled, whispering to the swamp, "What lies in the mud ain't trash. It's just waiting on a pair of patient hands." If you want to know what the old carpenter pulled from that stinking mud, and how it eventually made that slick developer Carter choke on a $10,000 check, stick around to the end. Hit that like button to send some strength to the old man, and let's get into it. Ray ran his heavily calloused thumb over the brittle yellowed pages of a leather-bound journal. The edges were frayed, stained with the dark sweat and embedded sawdust of a man who'd swung a heavy felling axe back in the 1920s, his grandfather. In the quiet, dust-mote-filled air of the county archives room, the only sound was the slow, rhythmic ticking of a brass wall clock. Old Miller, the county librarian, let out a soft sigh as he slid a heavy tracing paper property map across the scarred wooden table. The document smelled of deep mildew, forgotten history, and damp basements. Ray leaned in close, adjusting his wire-rimmed reading glasses on the bridge of his nose. He traced a faded, dotted line on the map that read Mill Pond, his finger moving slowly, deliberately. Then he looked down at his grandfather's slanted cursive handwriting in the journal. The diary detailed a massive king log, a piece of old-growth timber so incredibly dense, so impossibly heavy with resin, that it had snapped the thick steel hauling cables and sank straight to the bottom of the holding pond nearly a century ago. The loggers back then didn't have the machinery to drag it back up, so the mud claimed it. "You absolutely sure about this?" Ray Miller whispered, adjusting his own thick spectacles and looking around as if someone might overhear them. "Parcel 4, it ain't nothing but toxic mud-snapping turtles and rotten stumps now. The county's been trying to dump that worthless stretch of land for years. Nobody wants it. It's a dead zone." Ray remained silent for a long moment. He looked down at the thick stack of pink final notice bills peeking out of his faded jacket pocket. He knew exactly what the risks were. If he was wrong about this, the family woodshop he'd bled for his entire life, the shop where he'd learned to hold a chisel before he could ride a bike, would be locked up by the bank by Friday afternoon. The padlocks were practically already on the doors. But if his grandfather's words held true, there was a fortune buried beneath that suffocating sludge. A fortune that could save his legacy. "What's lying under that black mud ain't just trash," Ray said softly, tapping the old map with a thick finger. "It's my grandfather's sweat buried deep in the dark, and it's about time somebody woke it up." 30 minutes later, the atmosphere inside the county courthouse was a completely different world. The grand marble-floored hall hummed with the aggressive, fast-paced chatter of men in tailored suits and shiny Italian loafers. It was the annual tax lien auction, a ruthless feeding frenzy where local developers bought up distressed properties, broken dreams, and foreclosed farms for pennies on the dollar. The air smelled of expensive cologne, stale coffee, and raw greed. Standing right near the front display board, clutching an oversized coffee cup, was Carter. He was a local real estate shark with a reputation for bulldozing family farms to build soulless strip malls and concrete parking lots. Carter pointed a manicured, perfectly clean finger at the display board, laughing loudly with a tight circle of out-of-town investors. He drew a big imaginary X over the Blackwood swamp area on the map with his hand. "Look at this absolute garbage," Carter sneered, making sure his booming voice carried across the echoing room. The county actually expects someone to buy nature's toilet. You couldn't pay me enough to pave over that stinkhole. It's an insult to dirt." Just then, Ray pushed through the heavy oak double doors, the brass hinges groaning slightly under his weight. He wore a faded, patched denim jacket, the cuffs still visibly dusted with the morning's pale sawdust. He stood quietly at the very back of the room, his scuffed, steel-toed work boots a stark, unapologetic contrast to the polished leather shoes surrounding him. The room felt suffocating to the old carpenter, filled with loud men who traded numbers on paper without ever knowing the honest feel of a hard day's physical work. Carter spotted him almost immediately. A condescending, predatory grin spread across the developer's face. He nudged his buddy with an elbow, then strolled casually over to the back of the hall, hands buried in his expensive slacks. "You're in the wrong building, Carpenter," Carter mocked, looking Ray up and down like he was a stray, flea-bitten dog wandering into a steakhouse. "The charity food bank is on the next block over. This place is for people who actually have money to burn." Ray didn't blink. He didn't tighten his jaw. He didn't offer a clever comeback. He just looked right past Carter's expensive silk tie, keeping his rough hand firmly in his jacket pocket, his fingers resting gently on the familiar leather cover of his grandfather's journal. At the front of the room, the auctioneer tapped the microphone. The sharp, high-pitched feedback instantly silenced the chatter. "All right, folks, let's keep this moving," the auctioneer announced, adjusting his tie and shuffling his papers. "Next up on the block is Parcel 4, the Blackwood Swamp Tract. It's a distressed wet zone, strictly sold as is. We'll open the bidding at a very low $500. Total silence fell over the hall. Not a single bidding paddle moved. A few men chuckled, softly checking their expensive watches or pulling out their phones. Carter leaned back against a cold marble pillar, picking his teeth with a wooden toothpick, waiting for the worthless item to pass without a single bid. "Do I hear 500? The auctioneer asked, his voice echoing off the high-painted ceilings. "Going once for 500 on the swamp." In the back row, a worn yellow bidding paddle slowly went up in the air. 800, Ray's voice rang out. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, deep, and absolutely certain. The entire room turned to look. For a split second, nobody even breathed. Then Carter let out a loud, barking laugh that shattered the quiet. It started a chain reaction. Soon, half the hall was chuckling, men whispering cruel insults behind their glossy auction catalogs. $800, Carter yelled over the rising noise, wiping a fake tear of amusement from his eye. "Congratulations, old man. You just bought yourself the biggest mosquito breeding ground in the entire state. You better take that money and buy a good net." The auctioneer quickly banged his wooden gavel before the bidder could change his mind. "Sold for $800 to bidder number 42. Ignoring the wave of mockery washing over him, Ray walked straight to the clerk's table at the front. His hands didn't shake even a fraction of an inch as he pulled a crisp cashier's check from his beat-up leather wallet. $800, representing nearly every last cent of his remaining savings. It was the money that was supposed to keep his shop lights on for one more month. He slid it across the polished mahogany desk. The clerk gave him a long, pitying look, silently stamping the heavy paper deed and sliding it back. Ray took the paper. He didn't look at Carter's gloating face. He didn't look at the laughing investors. He just walked right back out those heavy oak doors. He clutched the deed tightly against his chest, his eyes fixed dead ahead on the horizon, where the dark, imposing tree line of the swamp waited patiently. The brutal battle against the mud was about to begin. The rusted tailgate of the 1990 Ford F-150 rattled violently as Ray navigated the deeply rutted dirt road, finally killing the engine at the murky edge of Blackwood Swamp. It was high noon, but the dense, twisted canopy of Spanish moss blocked out the sun, casting long, eerie shadows across the stagnant water. The air was thick, heavy, and choked with the aggressive stench of sulfur, rotting vegetation, and deep decay. Ray climbed out of the cab, his boots crunching on the dry brush. He pulled a pair of heavy patched rubber waders from the truck bed and stepped into them, pulling the thick suspenders over his shoulders. Walking to the front of the truck, he cleared away a layer of pine needles from the hood and carefully spread out his grandfather's leather-bound journal and the tracing paper property map. He held them down with a heavy wrench against the slight humid breeze. He squinted, looking from the faded ink on the map to the swamp ahead. He lined up the angle of the midday sun filtering through the trees with a slight unnatural mound rising from the center of the black water. He cross-referenced the landmarks exactly as his grandfather had meticulously recorded them nearly a century ago. Right there, Ray muttered to himself, his thick finger tapping the hood of the truck. The developers only see a garbage pit, but that's my grandfather's sweat calling out. His first step into the water was a harsh reminder of what he was up against. The thick, viscous black mud instantly swallowed his boot past the ankle, gripping the rubber with a terrifying vacuum-like suction. Ray grunted, using his core strength to wrench his leg free, only to plunge his other foot deeper into the sludge. With every agonizing step, the mud seemed to fight back. He waded in until the toxic, foul-smelling water reached his knees. In his right hand, he gripped a heavy 6-foot length of rusted steel rebar. He raised the iron rod and drove it straight down into the muck, feeling it slide through layers of soft silt and decaying roots. Nothing. He pulled it up the suction, popping loudly, moved 2 feet to his left, and drove the rebar down again. He raised the rebar for the 20th time and slammed it downward. A dull thud echoed as the vibration shot violently up the steel rod, rattling his teeth. It wasn't the sharp, jarring ping of striking a submerged boulder. It was a dull, dense, heavy thud. The unmistakable, solid feeling of striking a massive piece of waterlogged timber that had been curing in an oxygen-deprived tomb for 100 years. A rare, genuine smile cracked across Ray's weathered face. Ignoring the foul water, he dropped to his knees, plunging his bare hands directly into the cold, black sludge. His thick fingers dug frantically like a dog unearthing a buried bone, clawing away the centuries of compacted silt until his fingertips brushed against something incredibly hard. It was rough, textured bark, petrified and solid as cold-rolled steel. "You hid real well, old man," Ray whispered, wiping a streak of black mud across his cheek. "But today you're coming up to the dry land." The moment of quiet triumph was violently interrupted by the aggressive roar of a modified diesel engine. A massively lifted, aggressively tired pickup truck tore through the brush, skidding to a halt right next to Ray's old Ford. 3 young, loud men tumbled out of the cab. They were local contract loggers, wearing expensive branded gear and sporting careless, arrogant grins. "Hey, look what we got here," the driver shouted immediately, pulling out his smartphone and hitting record, the bright screen glaring in the dim swamp light. "It's the county's new garbage man. You taking a bath in the toilet, old man? Or did you lose your dentures in the mud?" The other 2 boys howled with laughter, raising their own expensive phones to capture the pathetic sight from multiple angles. They nudged each other, practically tripping over the brush in their eagerness to get a better shot. Through the lenses of their high-definition cameras, Ray just looked like a crazy, desperate old man covered head to toe in foul-smelling black sludge, hugging a rotten, worthless stump in a dead swamp. "Smile for the internet, Grandpa," the tallest kid taunted aggressively, zooming in on Ray's mud-caked face and worn-out waders. "The whole damn county is gonna see the dirtiest man in America digging for trash. We're gonna make you famous, you old skunk." Ray didn't say a single word. He didn't yell at them to leave. He didn't defend his family's legacy to a bunch of ignorant kids who bought their tools with credit cards instead of earning them with sweat. He simply bit his lip, took a deep, steadying breath of the sulfur-choked air, and dove headfirst under the toxic, opaque water. The mud instantly filled his ears and blinded his eyes. Operating entirely by touch, his calloused hands traced the massive circumference of the submerged log, feeling for a gap between the timber and the solid clay bottom. He found a small opening. Gritting his teeth against the burning need for oxygen, he threaded a heavy, braided steel winch cable under the wood. He broke the surface, gasping for air and spitting out a mouthful of foul, gritty swamp water. He ignored the continued jeers from the bank. His cold, steady eyes were locked purely on the heavy-duty steel D-ring shackle in his hands. With a sharp twist of his wrist, he locked the threaded pin into place, securing the cable around the beast below. Ray wiped the thick sludge from his eyes and grabbed the winch remote. The cable was locked tight. Now it was time to see if the old Ford's electric winch had enough heart to break the swamp's death grip. Ray hauled his soaked, heavy body up into the rusted cab of the F-150. He slammed the heavy door shut, leaving wet, muddy handprints on the steering wheel. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip, throwing a burnt orange glare across the cracked windshield. He dropped the transmission into low gear, firmly planting his boot on the brake pedal. With his left hand, he engaged the 12,000-pound electric winch mounted to the heavy steel bumper. The heavy-duty motor whined immediately, a high-pitched, strained mechanical scream. Out on the mudflat, the thick braided steel cable pulled taut instantly, lifting completely out of the murky water. It snapped straight as an iron rod, violently shedding a heavy curtain of stagnant water and rotting green moss. But the log didn't move a single inch. Deep beneath the surface, centuries of dense, compacted clay had formed a perfect vacuum around the massive timber. The suction was an invisible, immovable anchor, holding the log hostage. The old truck's engine roared, black diesel smoke violently coughing out of the rusted tailpipe. The rear tires began to spin in the soft, loamy dirt on the bank, aggressively chewing through the thin layer of grass and digging a deep, muddy trench. The back end of the truck physically lifted off its suspension, groaning under the impossible tension. The winch motor was overheating fast, a sharp, bitter smell of burning electrical insulation leaking into the cab. Over the deafening roar of the struggling engine, the obnoxious laughter of the three young loggers pierced the air. "Give it up, old man," the tallest boy shouted, cupping his hands around his mouth to ensure he was heard over the diesel engine. "That mud ain't letting go of anything it already ate. You're gonna rip your own bumper off before that trash comes out." They were right about the suction. The mud's grip was easily generating a drag force, triple the actual weight of the submerged wood. But Ray didn't let off the switch. He stared dead ahead, his jaw locked tight, willing the machine to win. He pushed the winch harder, the motor screaming in agony, the heavy steel cable trembling so violently it hummed a terrifying high-pitched note in the humid air. Then a sharp, deafening sound shattered the afternoon. Bang! The core of the steel cable surpassed its maximum tensile limit and snapped violently in half. The heavy steel line recoiled with the explosive force of a massive whip, slashing backward and slamming brutally into the steel quarter panel of the old Ford, leaving a deep, jagged dent. The three young loggers instantly stopped laughing. They stumbled backward in genuine panic, dropping their phones and scrambling behind the massive tires of their lifted truck, realizing just how close they'd come to being decapitated by the flying steel. Inside the cab, Ray immediately killed the engine. The sudden, heavy silence of the swamp rushed back in, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the frayed, broken end of the cable dangling uselessly in the mud. He wasn't angry. He didn't curse. He just let out a slow, controlled breath. Machines had limits. His grandfather had known that. When raw horsepower failed in the 1920s, the old timbermen didn't quit. They used physics. They used the leverage of the forest against itself. Ray climbed out of the cab and walked to the truck bed, pulling out a heavy, double-bitted felling axe and a coil of heavy-duty logging chain. He waded back into the shallower mud and selected two sturdy dead cypress trunks leaning near the bank. With precise, rhythmic swings that belied his age, he felled them both, dragging the heavy logs to the edge of the water. Working methodically, he lashed the tops together with the chain, creating a massive, crude A-frame, a traditional logger's gin pole. He waded back out to the submerged log and secured the remaining length of the winch cable to the D-ring, but this time, he routed the line up and over the apex of the A-frame before running it back to the truck. This completely changed the geometry of the pull. Instead of fighting the mud by dragging the log horizontally against the suction, the A-frame would convert the winch's horizontal pull into a devastating direct vertical lift. But Ray knew the suction of the clay was still too strong. He needed to break the vacuum. He pulled a portable, gas-powered water pump from the truck bed, snapping the intake hose into the murky pond. He jammed the high-pressure output nozzle directly into the thick mud right next to the submerged timber. He yanked the starter cord. The small motor roared to life. High-pressure swamp water blasted deep into the dense clay, violently churning the mud and cutting through the compacted silt like a liquid knife. The water aggressively eroded the perfect seal that had held the log captive for a century. Bubbles began to violently boil on the surface of the black water, popping with thick, muddy burps. "Stupid machines only know how to pull sideways," Ray muttered to himself, climbing back into the truck cab. "You gotta lift it out with your head, old friend." He engaged the winch once more. The cable tightened, biting hard into the wooden apex of the A-frame. The heavy wooden structure groaned, bowing slightly under the immense strain. Then the swamp finally surrendered. With a massive guttural slurp that sounded like a giant beast exhaling, the vacuum broke. The enormous pitch-black king log erupted violently from the water, shedding hundreds of pounds of foul-smelling mud and centuries-old debris. It swung heavily from the A-frame, water cascading off its massive textured surface. It was easily the size of a small canoe, impossibly dense and completely intact. It was a monster. 10 minutes later, the massive timber was resting heavily in the bed of Ray's Ford, completely bottoming out the truck's rear suspension. Sitting there in the daylight, it was undeniably ugly. It was coated in thick, foul-smelling black sludge, its exterior heavily scarred, deeply pitted, and entirely unremarkable to the untrained eye. The three young loggers stepped out from behind their truck looking at the dirty, wet mass taking up Ray's entire flatbed. The initial shock of the snapping cable had worn off, and their arrogant smirks quickly returned. "You almost got us killed for a piece of rotten firewood," the driver scoffed, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "You're actually out of your mind. Good luck burning that wet trash, old man." They threw their cigarettes into the mud, piled back into their expensive diesel truck, and sped off down the dirt road, spinning their tires to kick a spray of dirty water toward Ray's boots. They were utterly convinced they had just watched a crazy old fool risk his life for a worthless piece of rotten garbage. Ray didn't even watch them leave. He didn't care what they thought. He pulled a sharp, heavy pocket knife from his denim jacket. He walked up to the massive, foul-smelling log and carefully scraped away a small 3-inch section of the hardened black crust. He brushed away the loose debris. Beneath the ugly, petrified exterior, the blade revealed a stunning, perfectly preserved grain. The wood was an incredibly dense, rich olive-brown color, completely untouched by rot. The anaerobic environment of the toxic mud hadn't destroyed the timber. It had protected it, sealing it away from oxygen and insects for 100 years, creating a piece of sinker cypress so perfect it was almost priceless. "Go ahead and laugh, boys," Ray whispered, running his thumb over the smooth, exposed wood. "History rarely looks pretty on the outside." The greatest risk was over. The swamp had given up its prize. But as Ray looked at the impenetrable steel-hard crust surrounding the beautiful core, he knew the real fight was just beginning. The true challenge wasn't getting the timber out of the mud. It was figuring out how to mill this iron-hard, fossilized bark without entirely destroying the priceless treasure hidden inside. "Before we go any further, I have a question for you. If you were Ray, sitting on the edge of bankruptcy, would you take a guaranteed $400 to survive the week, or would you risk losing absolutely everything for a piece of swamp trash? Let me know down in the comments what you'd choose." The next morning, the air behind Ray's dilapidated wood shop was thick with the smell of wet earth and ancient mud. The massive timber sat heavily on a set of reinforced iron sawhorses. Ray was methodically scrubbing the thick, hardened clay from the deep crevices of the bark with a stiff wire brush and a heavy-duty pressure washer. The harsh grinding sound was interrupted by the distinct heavy crunch of gravel. A brand-new, polished black SUV pulled aggressively into the small dirt driveway, stopping inches from Ray's shop doors. Carter stepped out wearing a sharp, custom-tailored suit that looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of sawdust and rusted tools. He immediately pinched his nose in disgust, waving his manicured hand to clear the smell of the swamp log. Carter didn't offer a greeting. He walked straight over to Ray's battered wooden workbench, pulled a silver money clip from his pocket, and tossed 4 crisp $100 bills onto the dusty surface. "I'm feeling charitable this morning, Carpenter," Carter said, a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. "I'll give you exactly $400 for that worthless deed. That's half of what you threw away. It's enough to buy you some groceries so you don't starve. I'm just going to fill that stinkhole with concrete and build a parking lot anyway. Take the cash before I change my mind." Ray turned off the pressure washer. The sudden silence hung heavy between them. He walked over to the workbench, picked up the 4 bills, and didn't even look at the money. He stepped right up to Carter and shoved the cash firmly back into the developer's expensive silk breast pocket. "I think I'll keep this charity food bank for dinner," Carter Ray said, his voice deadly calm. "What a blind man calls trash is usually a carpenter's treasure. Now get off my property before I find a use for my nail gun." Carter's smug grin instantly vanished, replaced by a flush of genuine embarrassed rage. He turned on his heel, stormed back to his SUV and sped off tires, spitting loose gravel across Ray's driveway. With the developer gone, Ray turned his attention back to the true challenge. It was time to open the vault. He spent the next 2 hours meticulously setting up his portable heavy-duty bandsaw mill. He checked the tension on the thick steel blade, carefully filed the teeth for maximum bite, and double-checked his measurements with a steel square. Cutting a piece of timber this dense with this much unknown history was a massive gamble. One wrong angle and he could instantly destroy 100 years of perfectly preserved wood. Ray pulled the starter cord. The gas-powered mill roared to life, the massive steel blade spinning into a terrifying silver blur. He slowly pushed the carriage forward, the screaming teeth biting into the petrified black crust. Instantly, a shower of bright orange sparks erupted from the cut. The dense, compacted sand, river grit, and microscopic stones embedded deep in the bark over the last century were violently grinding against the hardened steel of the blade. It sounded like metal chewing through solid concrete. Within 5 feet, the blade completely dulled out the friction, producing a thick, acrid smoke. Ray had to kill the engine swap in a brand new, expensive carbide blade and start again. He repeated this grueling, frustrating process twice more, refusing to rush, patiently peeling back the heavy layers of time. Finally, the saw broke through the end of the log. Ray shut the loud engine down and grabbed a heavy steel pry bar. He jammed it into the fresh cut and threw his entire body weight backward. The 2 halves of the massive log fell open like a heavy ancient book. Ray stood completely frozen. Beneath the ugly, scarred, impenetrable crust, the wood was absolutely flawless. The grain was incredibly tight, displaying a mesmerizing, swirling pattern of deep honey gold and rich, dark olive green. It was the highest possible grade of sinker cypress, completely untouched by oxygen or rot, holding a color that only a century of resting in mineral-rich mud could produce. It was breathtaking. A heart of pure gold hiding under a coat of steel, Ray whispered, his calloused fingers tracing the smooth, wet grain. "You didn't lie to me, Grandpa." But just as Ray let out a deep sigh of relief, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound broke the silence. Tick. Ray froze. He grabbed a nearby water hose and quickly sprayed down the fresh face of the cut, watching the water bring out the vibrant, glowing colors of the wood. But as he watched, his weathered face hardened into a mask of pure panic. The wood was suffering from massive, sudden moisture shock. Pulled from its suffocating wet tomb and suddenly exposed to the dry open air, the surface moisture was evaporating far too quickly. The intense, rapid change in pressure and humidity was violently stressing the dense cellular structure of the timber. Right in the dead center of the absolutely perfect olive-green slab, a faint, dark hairline crack appeared. Before Ray could even react, a sharp crack echoed off the woodshop walls. The hairline fracture violently tore open, extending half the length of his hand right before his eyes. It was known as checking a logger's worst nightmare. If that crack continued to spread and spiderweb toward the outer edges, this massive, priceless slab would be rendered structurally useless. It would lose 80% of its commercial value in a matter of minutes, turning a legendary treasure into a pile of expensive firewood. "Damn it, it's tearing itself apart," Ray hissed, his heart hammering against his ribs. 100 years asleep and waking up too fast is gonna kill it. He moved with desperate, frantic speed. He sprinted across the yard, grabbing heavy, soaking wet canvas tarps and frantically throwing them over the exposed faces of the wood, desperately trying to trap the moisture and violently halt the rapid evaporation. Cold sweat poured down his forehead as he realized he had just triggered the absolute fatal weakness of this ancient wood. Covering it was only a temporary bandage. To actually save this rapidly deteriorating masterpiece, Ray had to get it into a humidity-controlled drying kiln immediately. It was no longer a battle against the mud. It was a terrifying, high-stakes race against the air itself. The heavy, humid air of the evening hung low as Ray furiously wrestled the massive, violently checking slab of sinker cypress into his workshop. Using a heavy-duty chain hoist, he lowered the wet, heavy timber onto a solid steel rack inside a crude, homemade drying chamber, constructed from thick industrial tarpaulins and 2x4s. Every single second that the raw wood sat exposed to the open air, the hairline crack deep in its core threatened to spread. Ray didn't even bother taking off his mud-caked boots. He immediately sparked a propane torch and placed a blackened, dented aluminum pot over the blue flame. Inside the pot was a thick block of anchor seal, a specialized heavy-duty end-grain wax used by professional millers. As the wax melted and began to bubble aggressively, filling the small shop with a dense chemical smell, Ray grabbed a thick, natural bristle brush. He worked frantically, slathering heavy, dripping layers of the boiling hot wax directly onto the exposed end grain of the massive slab. The wood sizzled as the hot wax hit the wet pores, instantly sealing them shut. Wood dries out up to 10 times faster from the ends than from the face. By completely sealing the ends with a thick, impenetrable layer of wax, Ray was forcing the moisture to escape slowly and evenly through the broad faces of the slab, desperately trying to prevent the tension from ripping the timber apart. With the ends sealed, he carefully wedged perfectly uniform 1-inch wooden stickers underneath the slab, ensuring a flawless, even airflow across every single square inch of the wood's surface. Ray wiped a heavy streak of sweat and sawdust from his forehead, looking at the massive dark shape resting in the shadows of the tarpaulin kiln. He thought back to the faded, yellowed pages of his grandfather's leather-bound journal. "The thing resting under the mud is not trash," his grandfather had written in a steady, slanted script nearly a century ago. "It is honest sweat just waiting for a pair of hands patient enough to hold it." "You've been down there in the dark for 100 years, Ray whispered, patting the cold, wet wood. "Don't go rushing things now. Just take a slow, deep breath." He flipped the heavy breaker switch on the wall. A massive industrial exhaust fan violently roared to life, sucking the stagnant air out of the makeshift kiln. The most agonizing, nerve-wracking part of the milling process had officially begun: the waiting. Over the next 3 weeks, the swamp log dictated Ray's entire existence. The world outside the woodshop continued to close in on him. Every morning, the local mail carrier shoved another bright pink past-due final notice from the bank through the rusted mail slot in his front door. The letters piled up on his dusty workbench, a constant physical reminder of his absolute financial ruin. Ray's checking account was completely drained. He was eating canned soup cold directly from the tin, saving every dime for the expensive electricity required to keep the industrial kiln fans running 24 hours a day. There were late, silent nights when the stress became physically crushing. On the 12th night, Ray stood in the dim light of the shop, staring at the thermostat dial on the kiln controller. His hand trembled as he reached out, his thick, calloused fingers gripping the plastic knob. If he simply cranked the temperature up to maximum heat, he could aggressively boil the water out of the wood in a matter of days. He could pull it out, slap a cheap, glossy finish on it, and sell it to a desperate, uneducated buyer to immediately pay off his crushing bank debt. It was the fast, easy, greedy way out. But Ray stopped. He leaned in, peering through the small, scratched plexiglass window of the tarpaulin kiln. Under the harsh glare of the utility light, he could clearly see the deep, dark crack in the center of the wood. As the temperature inside the kiln fluctuated, the crack physically breathed, expanding and contracting microscopically, heavily stressed by the internal tension of the dense timber. If he cranked the heat now, that crack wouldn't just spread. It would violently explode, tearing the priceless slab into 2 worthless pieces of expensive firewood. Greed and impatience were the 2 things that always killed a masterpiece. Ray slowly pulled his hand away from the dial, leaving the temperature strictly locked at a slow, agonizingly gentle 110 degrees Fahrenheit. "You can't force nature to beat faster than its own heart," Ray muttered to himself, turning his back on the thermostat. Instead of forcing the heat, he leaned heavily on discipline. Every single morning, precisely at dawn, Ray walked into the stifling 110-degree heat of the kiln. He carried a heavy, professional-grade pin-type digital moisture meter. With a firm, practiced push, he drove the 2 sharp steel pins deep into the face of the wood. He meticulously recorded the exact percentage of water remaining in the cellular structure on a stained, heavily creased notepad. Day by day, fraction by fraction, he watched the numbers slowly drop. Finally, on the morning of the 22nd day, Ray reached out and pulled the heavy breaker switch down. The deafening roar of the industrial exhaust fan instantly spun down to a halt. A heavy, profound silence fell over the dusty woodshop. Ray unhooked the heavy bungee cords and peeled back the thick tarpaulin flap. The massive slab sitting on the steel rack looked absolutely terrible. The surface was heavily coated in a thick, dull layer of dried, milky wax crystallized sap and a heavy coating of fine dust. All of the vibrant, glowing honey gold and olive green colors had completely vanished beneath the ugly, chalky residue of the drying process. Ray didn't care how it looked on the surface. He pulled out the digital moisture meter, pressed his thumb firmly against the back of the device, and drove the 2 sharp steel pins deeply into the absolute dead center of the thickest part of the slab. The digital LCD screen blinked rapidly for a second, calibrating the electrical resistance between the pins. Then the number locked in at 8.0%. A slow, genuine smile spread across Ray's tired, deeply lined face. 8% was the absolute gold standard, the perfect, stable, Killine dried moisture content required for high-end legacy furniture building in the United States. Even better, Ray carefully traced his calloused thumb over the dark, jagged crack in the center of the wood. The severe moisture shock checking had completely stopped. The crack hadn't spread a single millimeter since he threw the tarps over it weeks ago. The agonizing patience had paid off. The wild, unpredictable beast of a swamp log was finally completely tamed. "You did real good, old man," Ray whispered, blowing a layer of dust off the wood. "You're finally ready to tell your story." But as Ray stared at the stabilized crack in the center of the massive slab, he realized a hard truth. The crack had stopped spreading, but it was still there. It was a massive, gaping structural flaw right in the middle of a perfect piece of timber. He couldn't hide it, and he couldn't cut around it without losing the massive scale of the table. If Ray was going to turn this piece of swamp trash into a masterpiece that would save his family's legacy, he couldn't just ignore the ugly, jagged wound. He was going to have to find a way to turn the massive flaw into the most breathtaking feature of the entire table. The deafening roar of the heavy-duty belt sander finally cut out, leaving a ringing silence in the dusty air of the shop. Bright morning sunlight cut through the grimy windows, illuminating a thick cloud of fine sawdust dancing in the air. Ray wiped his brow with the back of his calloused hand and stepped back to examine the massive 10-foot slab resting heavily on his steel workbenches. The surface was perfectly flat, but running straight down the dead center of the incredibly dense olive-green wood was a jagged dark crack, nearly 3 feet long. A few local woodworkers had stopped by the shop earlier that morning, poking their heads in to see what the crazy old man had pulled out of the swamp. When they saw the massive fracture, they immediately offered the same modern commercial advice. "Just tape up the bottom and flood that crack with a couple gallons of bright blue epoxy resin." One of the younger carpenters had suggested sipping his coffee. "Everybody on the internet loves those plastic river tables. You can pour it today, sand it tomorrow, and sell it by Friday. It's the easiest way to hide a disaster." Ray just shook his head. He refused to use cheap industrial chemicals to cover up 100 years of perfectly preserved history. He wasn't going to hide the flaw. He was going to use traditional generational craftsmanship to heal it. "Epoxy is for lazy hands," Ray muttered to himself, running his fingers over the jagged edges of the fracture. "This old beast deserves to be healed with real wood." He walked over to his lumber rack and pulled down a small, highly figured block of dark black walnut. The deep, rich chocolate color of the walnut would create a stunning, aggressive contrast against the honey gold and olive green hues of the sinker cypress. Using the bandsaw, Ray meticulously cut 3 perfectly identical, geometrically flawless hourglass shapes out of the dark wood. They were traditional Dutchman joints, commonly known in the logging world as bow ties. He carried the dark wooden bow ties back to the massive slab and carefully laid them horizontally across the jagged crack. With a heavy brass-backed marking knife, he scored the exact outline of the walnut shapes directly into the hard surface of the cypress, creating a microscopic razor-sharp trench. He fired up a plunge router carefully, free-handing the spinning carbide bit to hog out the majority of the waste wood inside the scored lines. But a machine could only get him so far. To make the joint structurally perfect and aesthetically flawless, he had to rely entirely on his hands. He turned the router off and picked up a razor-sharp 1-inch steel chisel and a heavy wooden mallet. The rhythmic, methodical tap, tap, tap echoed through the quiet shop. Ray's calloused, steady hands moved with a fluid, practiced grace that had taken 50 years to master. He placed the bevel of the heavy steel chisel perfectly into the microscopic line he had scored earlier. With a precise, controlled strike of the mallet, the razor-sharp edge sheared down through the dense cellular structure of the fossilized wood. Thin, delicate curls of olive-green cypress peeled away, falling softly to the concrete floor. There was absolutely zero margin for error. If his chisel slipped even a fraction of a millimeter outside the line, there was no undo button. A visible gap in the joint would structurally compromise the massive slab and ruin its aesthetic perfection forever. He worked for hours, breathing slowly, his eyes locked onto the razor edge of the steel. Finally, he cleared the last paper-thin shaving from the bottom of the mortise. He applied a thin, even coat of heavy-duty wood glue to the dark walnut bow tie and positioned it carefully over the recessed cavity. Ray picked up his heavy wooden mallet, took a deep breath, and brought it down hard. A solid, incredibly dense thwack of perfect compression rang out. The dark walnut bow tie seated itself flush into the olive-green cypress with terrifying, absolute precision. There wasn't a single gap wide enough to slip a human hair into. Opposing angles of the dark wooden bow tie physically locked the two halves of the crack together. utilizing the raw mechanical tension of the wood itself to permanently halt the fracture. The fatal flaw was no longer a weakness. It was a breathtaking display of masterful craftsmanship. He repeated the painstaking process for the remaining 2 bow ties, locking the massive slab together forever. The structural fabrication was finally complete, but looking at the massive 10-foot slab, it was still visually underwhelming. After hours of sanding, the surface perfectly smooth with ultrafine grit paper, the wood looked completely dull, pale, and chalky gray, completely covered in microscopic sanding dust. The soul of the masterpiece was still fast asleep. It was time to wake it up. Ray opened a heavy metal tin of pure natural tung oil. He poured a generous, thick puddle of the golden liquid directly onto the dead center of the massive pale slab. He grabbed a clean, lint-free cotton rag, pressed his heavy hand down onto the oil, and began to wipe it aggressively across the grain. It was absolute magic. The exact second the natural oil penetrated the thirsty, ultra-dry pores of the fossilized wood, the dull gray vanished completely. It was as if Ray had flipped a light switch inside the timber. The mesmerizing 3-dimensional grain of the sinker cypress violently exploded to the surface, practically glowing under the shop lights. Deep olive greens and vibrant honey gold swirled together like a turbulent frozen river of color. Right in the middle of the breathtaking canvas, the 3 dark black walnut bow ties sat proudly, a dark geometric contrast against the wild flowing grain. Before we see where this masterpiece ends up, I want to ask you a question. Do you think a massive crack in a table is a structural disaster that ruins the piece, or do you think it's a natural masterpiece that adds character? Drop a comment below and let me know. Ray stood back, his calloused hands resting on his hips. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a dirty rag, his chest heaving slightly. His eyes began to well up, a rare tear catching in the deep wrinkles around his eyes. He had taken a piece of worthless, foul-smelling swamp trash and transformed it into a legacy. The grueling, violent battle inside the dusty woodshop was officially over. Now it was time to take this ancient masterpiece out of the shadows and face the outside world. The atmosphere inside the sprawling county convention center was completely alien to a man who had spent his entire life covered in sticky sawdust and heavy motor oil. The annual Fine Woodworking Expo was a prestigious, highly exclusive gathering of elite boutique furniture makers, wealthy interior designers, and high-end pretentious art collectors. Soft, classical string music played gently through the concealed overhead speakers. The massive exhibition floor was covered in plush, thick carpeting designed to muffle footsteps, and every single booth was bathed in harsh, overly dramatic gallery spotlights. Ray's rusty, heavily dented 1990 Ford F-150 backfired loudly, a gunshot of exhaust that echoed off the concrete walls as he parked near the rear loading dock. As Ray and Miller, the old loyal county archivist, muscled the massive sinker cypress table through the heavy glass double doors, a sudden uncomfortable hush fell over the immediate area. Several young, stylishly dressed woodworkers, wearing immaculate, expensive leather aprons and thick-rimmed glasses, stopped talking to stare. They looked at Ray's faded, grease-stained denim jacket, his scuffed steel-toe work boots, and the raw, heavy piece of timber he was hauling. They exchanged arrogant, pitying smiles, whispering quietly to one another behind their hands. To them, Ray looked like a homeless scavenger who had somehow wandered into a high-society art gallery carrying a piece of backyard trash. Standing near a brightly lit display of aggressively polished neon blue epoxy river tables was Carter. The real estate developer was busy aggressively pitching a wealthy-looking investor on a new condo project, gesturing wildly with his manicured hands. When Carter spotted Ray struggling with the heavy wooden table, his fake practice smile vanished, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, arrogant disgust. "Are you completely out of your mind, old man?" Carter sneered, abandoning his investor and marching aggressively across the plush carpet to block Ray's path. "This is a fine woodworking exhibition. It's an elite art show. It's not a flea market for you to pawn off your rotting swamp garbage. You're embarrassing yourself. Turn around and take that piece of firewood back to your bankrupt shack before I have the security guards forcefully remove you." Ray didn't even break his stride. He didn't flinch, his jaw remained relaxed, and he didn't offer a clever comeback. He simply kept walking forward with a heavy, rhythmic step, forcing the arrogant developer to awkwardly leap aside or be physically run over by 300 pounds of solid timber. Ray and Miller carefully lowered the massive table onto a simple, understated pair of matte black steel legs in a quiet, poorly lit corner of the exhibition hall. Ray didn't ask the organizers for a fancy spotlight. He didn't put up a glossy, printed placard bragging about his brand. He didn't need to. Even in the dim, terrible lighting of the corner booth, the sinker cypress table absolutely commanded the room. It possessed a heavy, ancient gravity that made the surrounding modern, flashy epoxy tables look like cheap, disposable plastic toys. The rich, three-dimensional grain of the olive green wood seemed to violently swirl and flow beneath the flawless tung oil finish, reflecting the ambient light like a deep, frozen river right in the middle of the breathtaking canvas. The three dark black walnut bow ties sat proudly, a testament to masterful old-world craftsmanship that no machine could ever replicate. Within 10 minutes, a small, curious crowd had formed, abandoning the flashy booths to stare at the ancient behemoth. Suddenly, the crowd parted respectfully to make way for a distinguished older gentleman wearing a tailored tweed jacket and carrying a heavy brass-rimmed magnifying glass. It was Mr. Sterling, the most ruthless, discerning, and respected antique wood appraiser on the East Coast. Sterling didn't say a single word. He stepped up to the table, completely ignoring Ray, and placed his bare hand directly onto the cool, smooth surface of the cypress. He closed his eyes for a second, feeling the density. Then he pulled out his magnifying glass and leaned in dangerously close, tracing his fingers over the flawless, flush joints of the walnut bow ties. His eyes widened in absolute, genuine shock. "My God," Sterling whispered, his voice trembling slightly with pure, unadulterated reverence. "This is original first-growth sinker cypress. The cellular density, the intense olive green oxidization. This timber has been submerged in an anaerobic mineral environment for at least a century. It's practically a fossil. Where on earth did you source this?" Before Ray could answer, Carter violently shoved his way to the front of the crowd. He was sweating, his face red with frustration, anger, and arrogant disbelief. He aggressively shoved his expensive smartphone directly into Mr. Sterling's face. On the glowing screen was the viral video the young loggers had recorded weeks ago, showing Ray covered head to toe in foul-smelling black mud, desperately wrestling with a filthy, rotting log in the stagnant water. "It's swamp trash," Sterling Carter barked, laughing mockingly, desperate to ruin the moment. "Look at this pathetic video. It's got 1 million views. He dragged it out of the most toxic, disgusting mud hole in the county just a few weeks ago. The old fool is trying to scam you. It's garbage." Sterling didn't look disgusted. In fact, as he watched the shaky video of Ray manually pulling the massive log from the mud with a rusty chain hoist and A-frame and sheer physical willpower, the appraiser's eyes lit up with a burning, intense fire. "You absolute uneducated fool," Sterling said coldly, glaring at Carter with utter contempt. "Do you have any idea what you just showed me?" Carter's arrogant smile faltered, confusion washing over his face. "Proof that he's a garbage scavenger. You just handed me absolute, undeniable proof of provenance." Sterling fired back, his voice echoing loudly across the quiet exhibition hall, silencing every other conversation. "In the world of high-end antiquities, provenance is everything. This video proves without a shadow of a doubt that this is an authentic hand-salvaged century log. It wasn't ripped out of the ground by a soulless corporate excavator that would have destroyed the fibers. It was pulled from the depths by the raw sweat of a true craftsman." Sterling turned his back on Carter, completely dismissing him like a pesky insect, and looked directly into Ray's tired, weathered eyes. "The bow tie joints are mechanically flawless. The grain is historically perfect," Sterling said, reaching into his tweed jacket and pulling out a heavy, leather-bound checkbook. "I don't need to negotiate. I will give you $25,000 right here, right now, to put this masterpiece in the center of my private gallery." A collective stunned gasp ripped through the crowd of elite woodworkers. $25,000 was a staggering, record-breaking sum for a raw, live-edge table at this exhibition. Carter stood frozen in place. All the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly, pale, and terrified. His jaw hung open, but no words came out. He had just publicly called a $25,000 masterpiece a piece of rotting garbage. He was utterly, completely humiliated in front of the most powerful investors in the state, permanently destroying his own reputation. The mocking whispers that had followed Ray all morning completely vanished. Instead, They were replaced by the frantic, rapid-fire clicking of smartphone cameras as the crowd desperately tried to photograph the legendary table. Ray didn't gloat. He didn't rub it in Carter's face. He calmly accepted the heavy paper check from Mr. Sterling, folded it neatly in half with his calloused hands, and tucked it securely into the breast pocket of his faded denim jacket. He turned to Miller, giving the old archivist a slow, meaningful nod. The grueling, terrifying financial war was finally over. He had saved his family's legacy. But with $25,000 in his pocket, Ray knew the story wasn't quite finished yet. He still owned the Blackwood Swamp, and the world now knew exactly what was hiding at the bottom of it. The next morning, the air inside Ray's woodshop smelled entirely different. The suffocating heavy stench of impending bankruptcy and fear was completely gone, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of fresh pine, sawdust, machine oil, and hot black coffee. The quiet peace of the morning was abruptly interrupted by the heavy, aggressive crunch of tires on gravel. Carter's sleek black SUV pulled into the dirt driveway. Carter stepped out. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit, and he certainly wasn't wearing his usual arrogant smirk. He looked tired, desperate, and deeply humbled. The viral video of the swamp log had caught the attention of major commercial logging corporations. They realized that if Ray had pulled one $25,000 log out of that mud, there were likely dozens more buried beneath the surface. The Blackwood Swamp was no longer a toxic liability. It was a gold mine, and Carter wanted to desperately steal it before the big corporations moved in. Carter carried a crisp, formal manila folder tightly under his arm. He walked nervously into the dusty shop and stood awkwardly by the massive bandsaw, watching Ray calmly sharpen a heavy hand chisel on a wet stone. "I underestimated you," Ray Carter said, his voice completely lacking its usual bombastic, booming volume. "You got incredibly lucky with that one log. But we both know that swamp is mostly just dead mud, disease, and liability. I'm here to make things right." Carter slid the manila folder onto the workbench. "I'm offering you $10,000 for Lot 4, Carter said, forcing a weak salesman's smile. "That's more than 10 times what you paid for it at the auction. You've got your 25 grand to save this shop, and now you can walk away from that mosquito-infested mudhole with a massive guaranteed profit. It's a win-win." Carter was absolutely certain the old poor carpenter would be blinded by the sudden influx of cash. To a man who was eating cold soup a week ago, $10,000 was a small fortune. Ray didn't even look at the contract. He calmly wiped the steel blade of his chisel with a dirty rag, picked up his chipped ceramic mug, and took a slow, deliberate sip of black coffee. He looked Carter dead in the eyes, his expression as hard, cold, and unyielding as the fossilized wood he worked with. "I think I'll keep this charity food bank money for dinner," Carter Ray said, perfectly throwing the arrogant developer's own mocking words from the day he offered $400 right back into his face. Carter flinched violently, as if he had been physically slapped across the jaw. "That mud isn't just real estate to me," Ray continued, his voice low, steady, and dangerous. "It's a graveyard of my grandfather's sweat. It's my family's legacy, and there isn't enough dirty, speculative money in your entire bank account to buy a single ounce of it. Now get off my property before I lose my temper." Carter didn't argue. He didn't threaten to sue. He just turned around, his shoulders slumped in absolute humiliating defeat, and walked back to his expensive SUV. He drove away slowly, the tires barely kicking up any dust, realizing he had just lost the biggest deal of his pathetic career. 3 months later, the old woodshop was completely transformed. The heavy, rusted padlocks were gone from the doors. The crushing bank debt was paid in full. The machines were humming with fresh oil and razor-sharp blades. Ray was standing at his workbench when he heard hesitant, shuffling footsteps at the door. He looked up to see 3 young men standing awkwardly in the doorway. They were the same 3 young contract loggers who had filmed the mocking viral video of him at the swamp. They weren't holding their expensive smartphones. They were holding their hats in their hands, looking down at their boots in deep, genuine embarrassment. We saw what you built, sir. We saw the article about the exhibition," the tallest boy said, his voice quiet, trembling, and deeply respectful. "We were wondering if you were hiring any apprentices. We want to learn." A lesser man would have thrown them out, blinded by petty vengeance and a bruised ego. But Ray was a master craftsman. He knew that the only way to truly honor a legacy was to pass it on to the next generation. Ray didn't say a word. He reached under his bench and pulled out 3 heavy canvas shop aprons and 3 dull, heavily rusted hand chisels. He tossed them onto the workbench in front of the boys. "If you want to learn how to aggressively push wood through a power saw," Ray said gruffly, pointing to the door, "you're in the wrong place. But if you want to learn how to respect the wood, pick up those chisels and start sharpening. We've got a lot of mud to wash off." The boys eagerly grabbed the aprons, their faces lighting up with genuine, profound gratitude. The Blackwood swamp was still a dark, foul-smelling mud hole. But as Ray watched the next generation of woodworkers awkwardly try to sharpen their manual tools, he smiled warmly. No one in this county would ever dare call it trash again. The story of Ray, the old carpenter, comes to an end, but his lesson echoes loudly through the grain of the wood. The thing resting under the mud is not trash. It is just waiting for a pair of hands patient enough to hold it. Sometimes, the greatest, most valuable masterpieces in our lives begin in the darkest, most heavily despised and overlooked places. If you respect the calloused hands and the unyielding patience of a true craftsman, hit that subscribe button. And drop a comment below if you've ever turned the tables and proved everyone wrong when the whole world doubted you.